Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Frontline update for the 10th of June 2023. Just as a preamble to my own update, it's always difficult when there is a really active frontline taking place because you know there's a lot of activity, you know there's movement on the maps, but because in this case the Ukrainians have really tight operational security, there's virtually no information coming out formally from the Ukrainians, and the information that comes out from the Russian is pro-Russian information that will talk about the Ukrainian losses. In fact, you've just got that one bit of video. Really, we've got one bit of video and footage that's being pumped out over and over by the Russians to suggest that Ukrainians are faltering or whatever. And that supposedly, you know, the Russians would claim that that should be extrapolated across the whole kind of front line, and their counteroffensive has failed, even though that's like just a tiny proportion of what's been going on and is not at all representative and is arguably not as big a problem as some people have made out. Anyway, the issue is that it might not look like there's any activity going along as according to the maps. Deep State map has another day, that's a pro-Ukrainian mapper, but another day of no change on the front line whatsoever. And there's clearly change, so that they are under constraints from the general staff, probably not to publish anything, and so it's up to other mappers. Suryat Mats, pro-Russian mapper, has absolutely no change, and so, oh my goodness, Andrew Perpetua, slightly more accurate, has some sources on the ground, does a lot of mapping, so there's quite a bit coming from him, but again, no real knowledge as to change in certain areas, even though there definitely will be change. So that's my kind of caveat, I guess. If we go to our usual starting place, which is in the northeast sector, Kupiansk-Kreminna, we have in the ISW, sorry, I'm in the wrong place there. That's a good start in it. The Russian Southern Group of Forces spokesperson claimed that Russian forces repelled 3 Ukrainian ground attacks in the Lysychansk direction. So if I'm going to go to my map, that's Kupiansk here, that's Svatova there, and Lysychansk is kind of in this area, Lysychansk, so that's a Bilohorivka. Now, that's to say that 3 Ukrainian attacks. Well, we've heard that Bilohorivka has been pretty tough for the Ukrainians, and they've been on the defensive there with the Russians kind of partially surrounding it, but it's quite mountainous ground around here, so that's actually particularly difficult for the Russians to get to make a lot of progress. There's some claims that they have some purchase in the village, perhaps, but for the Ukrainians to have be committing 3 counterattacks in the area, that's quite significant. A Russian mill blogger indicated that limited engagements near Bilohorivka continue, and claimed that Luhansk People's Republic, LNR, made marginal advances in the area. Former LNR official claimed that Russian forces control most of Bilohorivka. The ISW is unable to confirm this claim. Now, Bilohorivka itself as a town is basically completely flattened. Okay, if you look at more recent satellite imagery, this is the map I use is Google Maps, which is 2018, mainly 2018 imagery, and so it won't show any of this. But that is basically rubble now. It's a very small town, as you can see. It's not big at all. And to say that Russians have control over most of it, it may or may not be true. But actually, it's not greatly. I mean, there's nothing to this place. There are apparently basements in some of these buildings where previously Ukrainians have been kind of hiding out and whatnot in order to operate. But there's the mountains around here that kind of look onto Bilohorivka. That means that. In fact, let's have a look at the topographical map. So here you can see Bilohorivka in this kind of dell, or in this flat ground as the river comes through, much lower ground, and the higher ground, there are sort of mountains in the area surrounding it. And so actually, if you're in Bilohorivka, you're just, you know, able to be, you know, pot shots can be fired at you from all sides there. So I don't know that Bilohorivka itself has too much kind of value in terms of holding on. But anyway, that gives you an understanding of the topographical surroundings to Bilahorivka. Anyway, Cherevati also stated, so Ukrainian spokesperson, that Russian forces are anticipating Ukrainian attacks, but are unsure where Ukrainian forces would attack on the Luhansk front. This is interesting. So Ukrainian sort of PR position is that they think we're going to attack here, but they're unsure where we're going to attack. This is kind of telling the Russians that they're unsure. And telling us that they think the Russians are unsure. And I think the Russians probably are unsure, because I was speaking to Tim White yesterday. We were just having a chat about the front lines. And this area has been particularly quiet, comparatively speaking. It's all going on in Zaporizhia. But you know that if you're going to do counteroffensives, you're going to have feints, you're going to have decoys. Is this, are there decoys taking place down in the southern area? And then they're going to do major hits around, I don't know, somewhere on the eastern front? Are they going to do a feint or a decoy up here to fix Russian forces up here? Or are they just going to leave Luhansk alone completely? I mean, it's really quite quiet up here. There's, usual kind of attacks in some of these places, but nothing unusual. And then, we basically come down to Bakhmut. It's just really relatively little happening elsewhere. So let's do that. Come on to Bakhmut. So I guess let's look at the map here closely, just to remind you of my map in the Bakhmut area. Particularly, there are three coloured lines. All of them refer to Russian defensive positions. That's not the case elsewhere. Blue is usually where the Ukrainians are. Red is where the Russians are. So red here is Suryat Mat's pro-Russian mapper. Blue is Andrew Perpetua, pro-Ukrainian mapper, and yellow Deep State Map, pro-Ukrainian mapper. There are basically no changes to the actual map in the Bakhmut area at all, but there is activity taking place. There are claims that the Ukrainians have made advances. In fact, let's go and look at the ISW. So Cherevati reported that Russian and Ukrainian forces conducted 15 engagements near Bakhmut yesterday. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces made limited advances west of Bakhivka and toward Klishchivka, and that Ukrainian forces conducted assault operations near Dubovo-Vasilivka. I was watching Andrew Perpetua's live stream last night, talking about how, well, on the one hand, apparently the Russians are still reinforcing this area. So I was talking yesterday about whether the Russians are going to be seeing Bakhmut as important as they did maybe a month ago, as this big PR win. Now that it's all happening on the Zaporizhia front, do you still continue to reinforce this area? Or are there more important places? Crimea is, target number one, surely. So I would suggest that would be, and it's a super important place to put their reinforcements, but they still appear to be reinforcing Bakhmut. And obviously they don't want their forces in this area to completely capitulate and lose this big PR gain for them. And perhaps leading to a larger movement of Ukrainian troops that would then require the Russians to really think hard about what they need to do. So I guess they're caught between a rock and a hard place in some sense. So they are still reinforcing, but at the same time, there are claims that they might be pulling out of the Dubovo-Vasilivka area, perhaps Zalizhnensky area. There are some natural places to fall back. When we talked about the Russians taking this area, we talked, I don't even remember now, it seems so long ago, when the Russians were taking Vuhledar. There's both a railway line and there are rivers that can be used as defensive lines. So it might make more sense for the Russians to pull back to behind sort of Blahadatny. There are claims that the Ukrainians are pushing west towards Yahidny, but also west towards Bakhivka. Now, there are some claims that this reservoir here, which is dry, I mean, it was blown and it emptied out. I don't know, it's completely dry, but there are some claims that the Ukrainians control the whole of this reservoir area, which means they might be able to hit Bakhivka from the west by coming out from the south, rather than through this whole area that seems to be Russian controlled. But it could be that the Russians are pulling out of here to kind of form more sensible lines that are flatter, maybe along there, rather than have this area where they could get encircled and then cut off. So there are different claims as to what is happening and what might be going on, but no mapping changes to reflect what is almost certainly some change in control to the area. There are other claims about Ukrainians going on or having repelled attacks in the area. In fact, this is represented probably by Vuhledar's map, which is here, which has the Ukrainians pushing in Bakhmut and pushing in Klishchivka, but actually Russians pushing back in other places. I was talking about them pulling out of this area, but then there are other claims that no, they're pushing back there. So, not quite sure really what's going on here. There's less footage coming out of the whole Bakhmut area than there was a few days ago, and I don't know if that is a reflection of a tighter operational security up and down the front lines for Ukraine. So where this was kind of there were preemptive counterattacks here before activity in Zaporizhia, and when that was happening, the Ukrainians were shouting about that and saying, "Here's all the footage showing us advancing," and that's a kind of a PR win. But now it's all part of the entire counteroffensive, the larger picture that's going on. It could be that they've tightened up that operational security here, or they have just the front is stabilized here, and the Russians have reinforced to a point where they are only making marginal gains. I'm not 100% sure. There is some footage. Here's an ammunition dump going up in Vuhledar, the Russian ammunition dump. That's a pretty significant explosion there, but essentially not too much other news from this area. There are claims that there's quite a lot of activity around Klishchivka, and some rumors that the Ukrainians are ready to do basically a full-on attack on Klishchivka. Andrew Perpetua mentioned that last night. So I don't know, next 24, 48 hours could see a larger assault on Klishchivka. The Ukrainians have been trying to gain some ground along the canal further to the south, and if they can get across the canal with greater ease, then that would allow them to take Klishchivka, because it's downhill from there. They might want to attack Klishchivka from behind here. It might be easier. I don't know, flatter ground. We know that the Ukrainians have taken out a lot of Russian artillery in the area, particularly the self-propelled mortars that are generally would be closer to their targets. The range would be less on a mortar than tubed kind of howitzer artillery that will be set back much further back. But there's been a lot of taking out of artillery in this general area, so it could be that they are getting ready for that kind of assault. Then we move further down to Adiivka, and really not a lot to say about Adiivka here. So we'll go back to the ISW. It says Russian forces conducted limited ground attacks along this line, unsuccessful offensive actions near Opitny, Severny, Nevelsky, and Ukrainian forces repelling Russian attacks in Marinka. So this is to say all the usual kind of places: Opitny, Severny, Nevelsky, which is further to the south here. The Ukrainians had pushed the Russians back here in this area. Those three lines represent the Russian defensive lines, just because I wanted to see what the different mappers were saying. Syriac Maps still has a very charitable evaluation of the Russian lines here, whereas the two pro-Ukrainian mappers have their Russians pushed back, as there have been these kind of limited counterattacks in this area. But otherwise, not too much to report. And Marinka, we had reports that the Ukrainians were attacking yesterday. The Chechens were claiming that. And now it appears that the Russians are attacking that area. I'm not wholly sure. As you can see from my map, I don't really know who controls what there. I don't know what part Marinka will play, and I said this yesterday, in the larger counteroffensive. Do Ukraine try and, when they're doing a counteroffensive, do they, if it doesn't play a part in it, do they not bother putting any reinforcements there? Say, right, we're going to commit all our forces elsewhere, and it doesn't really matter what happens in Marinka. We're pretty sure that our existing forces there can still hold out against the existing Russian forces. And if we're going to do a big attack in Zaporizhia, then they're likely to draw forces away from Marinka, the Russians. In other words, like, you can forget certain areas and not do anything with them if they're not part of the larger operational kind of strategy, and you can be hopeful, or you can be pretty confident that the Russians won't make breakthroughs, because they will want to be drafting troops away from areas like that to support major theaters where the Ukrainians are making much more ground, so on and so forth. So I don't know. It'd be interesting to see what you think about that. So then we come on to the Zaporizhia front line, which is obviously the major uh, area for activity. And this is where I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. Not really sure what's going on in terms of exact, accurate lines on a map. In the ISW, in their sort of preamble, there's some general talks about this. Um, and actually, this also talks to what's going on in Bakhmut as well. Ukrainian forces continue counteroffensive operations in at least 4 areas on the front on June the 9th. The Russian MOD claimed that Russian forces repelled, limited, and localized Ukrainian ground attacks in the Kreminna area. Ukrainian officials stated on June the 9th that Ukrainian forces advanced 1.2 kilometers in continued offensive operations near Bakhmut. On June the 8th, that's 2 days ago, and I did report that yesterday. Ukrainian forces continued limited counteroffensive operations in western Donetsk, near the Donetsk-Zaporizhia Oblast border. So that's around Adiivka and Novosilka, and made tactical gains in the area. Ukrainian forces also continued ground attacks in western Zaporizhia Oblast overnight from June 8th to 9th and during the day on the 9th. And indeed, last night, there's talk about how the Ukrainians they have an advantage by having much greater capability to do nocturnal attacks, nighttime attacks, with thermal imagery on more of their vehicles than the Russians. In fact, there was a Russian captive POW that there's some video footage of him sort of cowering on the ground in some warehouse or something, and he still had his thermal imagery on, and it was really old 1980s thermal imagery. I just thought that was an interesting thing, because we talk about the asymmetry between the two forces. Where can Ukraine eke out a competitive advantage? Well, one of those will be in thermal imaging and optics in general, which will then supplies, data for the fire control system. So it's all about seeing the enemy first, getting your shot off first, and if your shot is more accurate, generally than the opposition, then you're acquiring your target, you're shooting at it, and you're destroying it before they can do anything. And if they can do that at night time, if they then get more success attacking at night, then you'll get a lot of operations taking place at night potentially. And then that will also make it more difficult for the drones, because do the Russian drones have thermal imagery? I mean, yes, they have that capability, but is it widespread? And if it's not, then actually you might see that the Ukrainians do a lot more work at night. Anyway, sorry. Ukrainian forces continued to attack, as I was saying, in western Zaporizhia. Russian source suggested that Ukrainian forces made incremental gains during the attacks. So if the Russians are saying that Ukrainians making incremental gains, they're probably making more than incremental. Putin has acknowledged on June the 9th that the Ukrainian counteroffensive recently began, and noted that Ukrainian forces still have offensive potential, a departure from previous Kremlin efforts to downplay the Ukrainian counteroffensives. This is important because also Margarita Simonyan yesterday said some propaganda stuff as per normal, but a bit of a change in tune, and this is really significant. I want to talk about this in the extra video. I've had time to do it today. My son's got a football tournament, so it's going to be difficult. But she was basically saying, if we freeze the front line and do negotiations, blah blah blah. Well, that's a massive departure from what she was saying previously, which is kind of sounding out the Russian public. What would they think about that? Are we starting to get a recognition amongst the Russian elites and the Russian military and political hierarchy that they're in trouble, and without a full national mobilization, they're going to struggle in the face of a Ukrainian counteroffensive? So there's a possibility that actually it things could change from a political point of view. Contrarily, much of the Russian information space prematurely claimed that the Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed. So this is all to do with that one bit of footage I was talking about. So a lot of the military bloggers saying, "Oh, it's all failed because a bunch of Bradleys were taken out and a few Leopards." After Russian forces damaged more Western-provided military equipment, Ukrainian officials directly acknowledged that Ukrainian forces expect to suffer equipment losses during counteroffensive operations. So this is super important as well. So the Ukrainians are happy, much happier than the Russians, to say, "Hey, yeah, that was difficult. We're gonna learn from that, and actually, do you know what? stuff happens. Okay, Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Malyar stated on June 9th that losses are expected during combat operations, and that, quote, military equipment that cannot be destroyed has yet to be invented. In other words, this is a way of controlling the information space, which is by being much more honest and saying, yeah, we're open to not everything going well. We are going to have losses, but as part of a larger picture, things are going to go our way. So what is happening across this front line? Well, the simple answer is lots. What do we know precisely? Not a lot. Still activity around Velika Novosilka. There's activity just to the south along this river line coming down there. There is activity to the west near Novodarivka. There's a lot of activity along the line south of Orikhiv and towards Vasilivka down here, Lobkova. So the Russians apparently retook Lobkova, but then it's now under Ukrainian hands, is the latest I've heard today. So Ukraine has entered the northern part of Lobkova next to Kamyanska, which is on the coast of the former Kakhovka reservoir. And that was yesterday afternoon. Well, this morning, Lobkova is ours, as according to War Frontline. And a bit earlier, Michael McKay was saying the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine report that Russian invaders shelled Zerebyanki and Zaporizhia region. This indicates that Ukrainian forces control Lobkova. In other words, if the Russians are shelling you in Lobkova, then you are in Lobkova and you're in control. So that would indicate, okay, let's go back to my map here. So this is going as far to the west as you can along this line, and you have Kamyanska. Vasilivka is going to be an important target for the Ukrainians because it's an important logistical hub, and it allows you control over a bunch of roads going forward, which then can get you down to helping to get to Melitopol. So this would be the westernmost route. So Mikhailivka has been hit by a lot of munitions over the last few days. I think last night again could well be HIMARS. That indicates that these places are going to be on the roadmap to Melitopol. You've got Tokmak, which has been absolutely hammered. Molochansk has been hammered over the last few weeks as well. So that is going to be one of the targets. And then much further to the east, you have other places going really far to the east. You've got Volnovakha being a potential target. So that's your range of Zaporizhia into southern Donetsk. It depends, whether they're going to come down to Berdyansk, stop at Melitopol, go further down to the south of Melitopol, get to Crimea, or try and break to Mariupol. Will there be several places they would want to take at the coast to provide a much wider channel, if you like? So would it look something like this? There are so many options, aren't there? And who knows what's going to happen. Sorry, that didn't work very well. So something like that and that, or would they go all the way down to Crimea? Only they know that at the moment, right? Anyway, that's what's happening in Lobkova. So Lobkova, I was saying, was just near Kamyanska. So that's there. That is now under Ukrainian control, as according to the latest information, which I have as Andrew. So along the whole of the front line here, the whole of the Zaporizhian southern Donetsk front line, blue represents the Russian lines, as according to Andrew Perpetua, just because I think he's mapping much more currently. And the red represents Suryat Mats, but Suryat Mat did no mapping yesterday at all. There were some changes, particularly in this area, for Andrew Perpetua. Anyway, as we go on in this area, we can see that there was some geolocation. Yeah, here it is. So the ISW talked about here. Geolocated footage published yesterday indicates that Ukrainian forces made marginal gains east of Vuhledar. Another Vuhledar, there's one near Bakhmut as well. So that is back over here in the Velika Novosilka area, or Velika Novosilka. You have lots of activity taking place here, both to the east and to the west of the town. And there, Andrew Perpetua showed a gain for the Ukrainians along here. So the Russians have been pushed back maybe further. This river lower ground there. It looks like the Ukrainians want the higher ground to both the east and west of that, so they're pushing both sort of down here and down there, and that gives them higher ground, which they can then use. High ground over there, they can then use to look over in that direction and pressure the the Russians there. So what the geolocation shows, all these geolocated coordinates from footage that's been shown by the Russians suggests. So I'm going to go into this map. So you've got Velika Novosilka there. You've got that river coming down there. And it could well be that Ukrainians have pushed all the way sort of down. You know, there's evidence that they have been or are in these places, you know, quite far behind Russian lines. Then it could be that, you know, the Ukrainians are making gains down there more than we are aware of in our maps. But anyway, it's really difficult to know how far the Ukrainians have got in this area, and indeed across the whole front line. That will be disappointing for people who want that information. It's just the reality of war. There's lots of discussion in the ISW about what's going on there, but you'll find that when it's so dynamic like this, and they're referring to the 8th and 9th, and they do their report at the end of the day, the end of, say, the Ukrainian day, it comes out that kind of night. So in terms of my day, UK time, the ISW is a very late night report. And then when you're having nocturnal activities after that, and then the morning activities today, like, and they're referring to 2 days ago as well previously, then a lot of this is just simply out of date already, even though it's the latest ISW report. So that basically says pretty much what Poulet Vallon says here in terms of where the activity is. Oh, going the wrong way. So where the activity is, but it won't give too much detail about where precisely the Ukrainians have got to, because there's very few geolocated bits of footage coming out. So as you can see, the Ukrainians are making gains, mainly into the grey zone there. Lobkove is now under Ukrainian control. So I'd say that's no longer grey zone. That you'd have the yellow line coming down there further as of this morning. But they are pressuring in a number of places. And then here around Velika Novosilka, you can see that they're doing that as well. There was claims about Russians retaking Novodorivka. Not sure about what's going on there. So it's not really a lot of difference between what we knew yesterday and now. But almost certainly the Ukrainians are putting the Russians under the cosh. So although the Ukrainians aren't producing a lot of footage in general in this whole area, there's a couple of bits that come out, which is basically of Russian forces running away. And I guess that from an operational security point of view, they're not giving anything away by this. There's no positions that's particularly, or no Ukrainian positions are being shown here. It's just Russian troops running away. So that's quite a good bit of controlling the narrative from the Ukrainian point of view to say, hey, we've got, and there's a couple of bits of footage like this, we've got footage of Russians doing a runner, routing, if you like, running away from some unspecified position, which shows that, you know, I guess things are going well for the Ukrainians, at least in some places. So they're just trying to counter that narrative that the Russians have put out with that one bit of footage of lots of equipment being lost. But we've talked enough about that. Anyway, that's the situation on the front line. If there's any significant changes throughout the day, unlikely today, but I will try and give like smaller updates if it is that significant. But yeah, I've told you about the difficulty of trying to get accurate mapping at the moment. Anyway, thanks for that. Thanks for checking out my videos. Please like, subscribe, and share. I really appreciate all the support you give. Take care. I'll speak to you soon.